Hey, what's going on, everybody? Timothy here with Mana Rocks. I think we know the deal by now. We're doing some Ikoria spoilers, and as far as I know, all of the spoilers from the Commander set have been completely released out into the public. We know all the new cards, the deck lists have been put out there, so we are now focusing on just the main set, actual Ikoria set, right? And there's been a lot of complaints from people that it's been a little bit of an overload. It's hard to keep track of which ones are which. And sure, I don't think it's anything to complain about, but there have been a lot of spoilers, hence all the videos going up on this channel. Thankfully, I've had the free time to look through them all. But from this point forward, we are looking at main set Ikoria spoilers with a focus on limited, but also if constructed implications or commander implications come up, we'll go ahead and mention them there. Remember, if this has improved your day in any way, shape, or form, even added just a tiny little bit of something to your day, feel free to show your appreciation with the subscribe button. And if not, it's cool. Thanks for hanging out. You can also find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks, but I want to go ahead and jump right on into our spoilers and start talking about them. Again, focus is unlimited here, so you'll notice my gut reaction for a card, if it's like super powerful or something, is usually means that it's powerful and limited, since I am typically a limited player, but also Commander is kind of like at the forefront of my mind. Constructed, not so much, but we don't have too many to talk about, somewhere around like the 15 to 20-ish range, which I guess is a decent number, but I'm not sure if they're trying to roll this out by the end of the week or what, but we're still getting little batches at a time here. But let's go and kick things off with a human payoff. It is Sanctuary Lockdown. 2 and a white for an uncommon enchantment. Humans you control get +1/+1. That's the second human lord that we've seen? The general, the mythic general, the black-white guy. Did that give humans +1/+1? I feel like it did. And then there was an uncommon that gave your legendary humans indestructible, but might have also given your humans +1/+1. At any rate, I think this is the second human lord that we have in the actual set, not counting the commander, of course, which gives the humans +2/+0, but not in the actual set. We've got an activated ability as well. 2 mana, tap 2 untapped humans you control, tap target creature an opponent controls. Okay, so that to me is definitely a payoff for being in humans when it comes to limited, right? First off, this is the type of card that I like it as like a one-off payoff effect because nobody else is going to want this, right? If people aren't drafting a quote-unquote human deck, like the black-white human deck that's going to be here in Limited, they're not going to take this card because it does nothing without humans. It doesn't like create a human. It doesn't make creatures. It doesn't do anything unless you have humans on board. And you probably need like a good 7-8+ humans in your deck before you actually become a human deck that actually wants this card, right? Or you need some sort of like repeated token generation on multiple cards before this is a card that you want in a deck that's not completely dedicated to humans. But if you are dedicated to humans, this is a really powerful card that you could probably pick up later in a draft too, right? This is the type of thing that on Arena, it should be going pretty late in the packs because the bots shouldn't be prioritizing this card. But it is a powerful card, right? You get an Anthem on an enchantment, which is just harder to kill than a creature. And you also get to just tap your creatures down to tap your opponent's best creatures. Obviously, the go-to here is that you want human tokens. You want to find a way to generate multiple human tokens and then use those as tappers and just keep your opponent's best creatures off your back. If it's possible in this format to just make like tons and tons of human tokens, then this card is actually quite insane. But I really haven't seen that many ways to make multiple tokens. You know, the black-white uncommon, it's 4 mana, exile a card from a graveyard to make a human. That's really slow, also considering that this costs 2 generic mana to activate. And then there was the cycling payoff that whenever you cycle your first card each turn, you make a 1/1 human. And that's good. That's very powerful, but it's kind of generically powerful enough and also had cycle in itself that other decks will be interested in that card. So I don't know if you're going to be able to go super wide with humans or if you're just going to draft every single human you see. Tapping 2 of your creatures, tap down your opponent's best creature is a pretty good effect, while also pumping all of your creatures is really nice too. So we'll see how the white-black human deck looks when we're finished with all the spoilers here, but this is a nice tool. And I like that it is so specific to humans that other decks have no interest in it. Another human payoff, I guess, here. We have Exuberant Wolf Bear. That is a chunky wolf bear, I guess. 3 and a green for a 4/4 uncommon wolf bear. 4 mana 4/4, always respectable stats. As far as the vanilla test goes, like on symmetry level, 2 mana 2/2, 3 mana 3/3, 4 mana 4/4. 4 mana 4/4 is basically the best spot on that curve because it fights all of the other 3/4s and hill giants and stuff that you typically see in a limited set. And then once you get to 5/5 and above, you really want abilities on there. But a vanilla 4 mana 4/4 is a perfectly respectable card, and probably about as good as you can get on just a vanilla on curve creature. But this does have a little bit of upside. It's strange though. It says whenever Exuberant Wolf Bear attacks, you may change the base power and toughness of target human you control to Exuberant Wolf Bear's power and toughness until end of turn. Okay, so I'm actually rereading this. Rereading this just now, I realized this card's a lot better than I thought it was. When I had initially read it before this video, I thought it exchanged the two creatures' power and toughness. So if I attacked with the wolf bear and I attacked with a 1/1 human, I thought they would swap power and toughness. And I was like, well, the wolf bear is just going to die if that's the case, right? But that's not what it does. It doesn't exchange them. It just makes the human copy the wolf bear's power and toughness. So you'll be attacking with the 4/4 still here, and then whatever human you choose is also going to become a 4/4. And note that if the wolf bear is somehow stronger, it's bigger than a 4/4, then that human's going to get 4/4 as well. You also got to watch out. There are some strange things that can happen here. If there's like a -4/-4 type effect in this, well, I guess never mind. Ignore everything I was about to say because this is a May ability. So what you do is you target your human, and then you give your opponent the opportunity to respond. And if they do respond and you give your wolf bear like -4/-4 and make it a 0/0, you can just choose not to make the human a 0/0. So ignore what I was about to say there, but it is a May ability. You target first, and then when the ability resolves, you choose whether or not you're going to switch the human to a 4/4 or whatever the wolf bear currently is. Plays very nicely with pump spells. Obviously, this is kind of like supposed to be a nod to humans in this set, but humans aren't really in green, so it's just one of those things where, like, if you happen to have a human on board, then the wolf bear gets a little bit better, but it's already just solid stats on its own that if you take this and you're drafting green and you're going for, like, a mutate deck or something like that, which obviously you don't want a lot of humans in your mutate deck, then, you're perfectly happy with it as a curve filler creature that may or may not have a relevant ability. But in a human deck, I don't know if there's going to be like green X human decks, green black, green white, maybe Abzan human decks or something like that. But this gets really powerful if you have human tokens on board. So be on the lookout for that. Again, I don't know how many humans you're going to have in your green deck, but it is a powerful card if you have any. Speaking of powerful cards, Cub Warden is a 3/4 cat. I'm sorry. Most of that is incorrect. 4 mana, 3/5 cat. There we go. We figured it. So 4 mana, 3 and a white for a 3/5 cat. It's a rare, thankfully, because this is a very powerful card. It has mutate for 2 white. So we've seen a couple of these where the mutate cost is essentially the same as the casting cost, but maybe a little more restrictive with mana symbols, but whatever. It has lifelink, so if you ignore everything else, just ignore the mutate stuff, you're pretty happy to play a 4 mana 3/5 lifelink in limited. You would pay 5 mana for that. You would go up to 6 is about where you would be unhappy for a 3/5 lifelinker. 5 mana would be like kind of a middling creature, but a 4 mana 3/5 lifelinker has a very impactful effect on the board when you play it, assuming you play it on curve. And, it's a stabilizing creature. If you're just getting beat down, you slam this thing on board, it basically stabilizes a game by itself. So very powerful, and if you're ahead, this just keeps you ahead, because a 3/5 attacks pretty well as well. It does have mutate, though, as we've already mentioned. So 4 mana to mutate it, and it says whenever this creature mutates, create 2 1/1 white cat creature tokens with a lifelink. So you just get to dump tokens on the board whenever this thing mutates. This is obviously the type of creature that you're happy to mutate onto something else because it gives that creature a lifelink, but it'll often be, I think, the top of the stack, because a 3/5 is likely to be better than anything else you have on the board at that point. Maybe. Remains to be seen exactly how often we're going to be curving like mutate into mutate, but this fits that bill of mutate creatures that give you something back, that give you some sort of card advantage. 2 1/1 lifelink and tokens is essentially a card's worth of stuff, right? And that means remember, the risk of mutate is that whenever you mutate onto a creature, you're giving your opponent the opportunity to 2-for-1. You're essentially cannibalizing one of your own cards in order to make a stronger version of that card. Very similar to an aura or something like that. But the fact that you get these triggers off of it and you get a card's worth of value back when this mutates means that, yes, your opponent might still 2-for-1 you, but you got a card back. So it's almost like a 1-for-1 if they kill this after it mutates. And then, obviously, if you can continue mutating onto Cub Warden, you're going to create an army of cats. And we haven't seen a go-wide board pump effect yet. Like your generic 4-mana, give everything +2/+1 or something like that. I don't think we've seen one yet. And most of the token generation stuff is in humans. This is a token generator that's in just, generically good creature type. We haven't seen like a cat payoff or anything, but I expect to see like a common inspired charge type effect that just gives a sweep and +2/+0. And that's what you're looking for with token generators like this, or with your human token generators, which we haven't seen a lot of either. So Cub Warden, easy A+ card. I keep forgetting to kind of like showcase the stuff going on here. They look comic booky, don't they? I don't know that there's like a theme to it or anything, because it's not really the Godzilla stuff. Anyway, moving on, more cats. Litterus of the Dream Den. 1 Orzhov, 3 mana total, 2 of which has to be black or white, any combination. It is your Orzhov companion. Remember, that means that you can keep it in your sideboard, and then if you meet the companion deck build-in requirement, you can cast it out of your sideboard. This is a pretty strict requirement. You're never doing this in limited, I'm sorry, but it says, the companion clause says, each permanent card in your starting deck has a converted mana cost of 2 or less. So we saw the 3 and above. That was the hippo thing, which was a pretty good card. This one is 2 or less, so everything in your deck has to be 1-drops or 2-drops. There's something there for constructed. Maybe somebody out there is going to go commander with this card, but the card is good enough. You don't have to like mess up your deck for it. In limited, it's not happening. You just can't build a deck of all 1s and 2s and have a competitive deck. It's not going to happen. But Lurrus has a lifelink, so if we ignore this companion stuff, because it's really just like a standard constructed thing, if we ignore it though, we get a 3-mana 3/2 lifelinker, which is a reasonable card, nothing crazy, but pretty easy to cast in most decks, and has an impact on the board. You often just trade it off and gain 3 life, which is what you need against an aggressive start or something like that. But it's got a very powerful just passive ability. It says, during each of your turns, you may cast 1 permanent spell with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard. And remember, you don't have to do the companion thing to just play this in your deck. And then whenever you play it, you just have this effect on board, and you can keep looping like 1-drops and 2-drops. And, it's a permanent. You can't play lands because it does say cast. But 1-drop, 2-drop creatures that end up going to the graveyard, just bring them back with Lurrus, and you can bring them back over and over again. So your opponent has to kill this, otherwise you can just keep like chump blocking with your 1s and 2s and keep bringing them back every turn. Not a lot of 1s and 2s that are coming to mind out of this set that are things that I want to keep recurring over and over again, but it is still a powerful ability nonetheless. Now, obviously, if I have this card in my limited deck, if I open it in sealed, or I'm drafting and I pick this card up early, I'm pretty happy with it, but it does mean I want to prioritize a couple 1s and 2s. Don't try to take all 1s and 2s. It's not worth it. Even in, let's say, in some odd, crazy world, you do make a limited deck where this is your companion, and then you cast this on turn 3 and your opponent kills it, well, there it goes, right? You're now stuck with a deck full of 1s and 2s. So don't even try to make it work. It's not worth it. But the effect that it has, if you do have a couple valuable 1s and 2s in your deck, is pretty strong. It seems like a good inclusion in the actual deck, not a good conclusion as a companion. Moving right along, though, we've got Tentative Connection. 3 in a red for a common sorcery. It costs 3 less to cast if you control a creature with menace. So again, that red-black theme of menace matters in this set. The effect is, act of treason. Gain control of target creature till end of turn. Untap it, gains haste. And this is cheap enough with a menace creature on board that I could see this actually being used to give your own creature haste every now and then, which is just a thing you can do with act of treason effects normally, but never really comes up because it's so expensive, right? But this ends up costing 1 mana. So if you go menace creature plus This now costs 1 red mana. You can use this as one red mana, give target creature haste, which, you know, might come up in 1 out of every 50 games or something like that. But it is something to keep in mind. Honestly, though, that's kind of like a corner case thing. We're just thinking, we don't want to pay 4 mana for an Act of Treason. It's just not a thing you want to do. You know, think Portent of Betrayal and Theros Beyond Death. It's just not a card you play unless you have, like, actual sacrifice energies. There's not a lot going on. Not a lot of that going on in Ikoria, from what I can tell. I haven't seen really, like, a sacrifice outlet or anything like that. Granted, this does get a little bit cheaper if you do have a menace creature on board. So if there happens to be like a menace creature that also ends up being a sacrifice outlet, then Tentative Connection is actually like a card that you're actively looking for in limited that other people probably won't be interested in. 4 mana is not going to cut it, but if you have a bunch of menace creatures and you're playing an aggressive deck, which tends to go fairly well with having a bunch of menace creatures, this might be, you know, a finisher type card that you want like one of in your limited deck. It's a cool design. Again, it gives like this tiny little payoff to having menace creatures, but you still got to want the effect, right? It doesn't matter how many menace creatures you have. If you're not super aggro or you don't have sacrifice effects, you still don't want this card. So, I don't know. We'll see how the menace deck looks when all is said and done and we've got a full picture of everything. It's kind of how I'm thinking about the keyword matters abilities that are going on here. It doesn't seem like there's a ton of payoff, that there just happen to be there. But anyway, moving right along. Blitz of the Thunder Raptor is 1 in a red for an uncommon instant. It deals damage to target creature or planeswalker equal to the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard. If that creature or planeswalker would die, exile it instead. So this is a okay removal spell. I mean, it's an efficient removal spell if you are casting it on like turn 5 or 6 and you're playing like the Cyclone deck, right? The awkward thing about this card is that it has the potential to deal a lot of damage, but A, you need to draft around it. You need to have a bunch of instants or sorceries. B, you need to cast those cards or get them into the graveyard. And C, this is a 2-drop removal spell that you can't cast on your opponent's 2-drop, right? It's really awkward when, you know, your opponent plays like a 2-mana 2/3 and you're looking at your spell that's supposed to kill your opponent's 2-drop, you know, your 2-mana removal spell you want to trade for their 2-drop. And you just can't do it because this is the type of card you can't cast on turn 2. You just don't have that many instants or sorceries in your graveyard on turn 2. So this is, you know, actually late game removal disguised as early game removal just because it has a cheap casting cost. But it's one of those things where it's costed in such a way that in the late game you can cast this plus cast something else in the same turn. Or maybe cast a spell to up the instant or sorcery count in your graveyard and then have this as a removal spell. So I expect this to actually be like second tier removal, but if that blue-red spells matters deck really comes together, or if there is like a really strong Cyclone deck where you actually just want to cycle all of your instants and sorceries away, that this card gets a little bit better. This is a card that I want if I'm in a blue-red Cyclone deck, right? It also might incentivize me to play a couple off-color cyclers, but at the best, you know, best case scenario, this is a 1-for-1. It never gets better than that, and it takes a little bit of work. It's the type of card that can get stuck in your hand. There are big creatures in this format, so if your opponent goes, hey, mutate, I now have a 6/6, you know, Blitz of the Thunder Raptor is not going to take that card out in any reasonable time frame, and you're just going to get beat down if this is supposed to be your answer to it. So expect this to take out smaller creatures than you really want it to. Expect to really only play it in a Cyclone Matters deck, or if that blue-red like spells deck really does come together, I can see this getting a little bit of a bump up. But as it stands right now, I think this is actually probably like B tier removal, not quite in the A range. Despite being really cheap, right? People see cheap mana cost and removal, and they assume it's always great, and it just doesn't really strike me. You know what this reminds me of? Let's go back for a second. This is a pretty good analog to this. This reminds me of from Guilds of Ravnica. There was a card called Necrotic Wound. It was a single black mana. It gave a creature -X equal to the number of creatures in your graveyard. This is basically, you know, very similar. It also exiled. It did the same thing essentially, except it counted creatures in your graveyard instead of instants and sorcerers in your graveyard for cheap, 1 black mana. But you couldn't cast that card until like 5 or 6. When you did cast it, it was efficient, right? You could kill a creature and then do something else in the same turn. But if your opponent was in Boros and just slamming you turn after turn, and you're sitting here looking at your Necrotic Wound, and it could have been any other removal spell. You know, turn 5 comes around, you've only got 1 or 2 creatures in your graveyard, it still doesn't kill like your opponent's 3 mana 3/3. And Blitz of the Thunder Raptor is very similar. Granted, it should be easier to get instants and sorceries in your graveyard due to cycle, and then it should be to get creatures in your graveyard, but we'll see. I'm kind of talking myself down on it. I'm not a big fan, but anyway, enough about that. Enough about the Blitz. Next up is Patasia Tiger. I wanted to say Viper so bad. Patasia Viper. This is Tiger, and despite having flying and wings and all that stuff, it's just a cat. They didn't want to make this one a dinosaur cat or anything like that. It's just a cat, whatever, you know, an ordinary, normal cat with wings. Patasia Tiger is 4 and a white for a 3/4 common flyer. We've seen another 3/4 common flyer for 5 mana in the set. That one had Mutate and I believe drew a card whenever it dealt combat damage, ? You guys can correct me on that. But I remember saying for that one that a 5 mana 3/4 flyer is just like respectable stats. You know, you want a little bit better than a 3/3 flyer for 5, and that extra point of toughness matters, but you want just like a tiny little bit to push it over just a regular playable average card. And this has a little something. It says when Patasia Tiger enters the battlefield, target human you control gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Again, more of this like human matters stuff on non-human creatures. We saw the wolf bear, we see this Patasia Tiger. I hate when they do stuff like this in a limited set where they're like, all right, here's this creature type that matters, but you have to play a bunch of stuff that is not of that creature type in order to enable that stuff, right? This doesn't make me want to draft humans. This just makes me want to draft a 3/4 flyer for 5, and if I happen to have humans laying around, it's fine. Of course, this is a little bit more on the nose than the wolf bear, since it is in white, and a lot of humans are in white, so I suspect you're going to be able to cast this and give something a reasonable pump a decent amount of time. I'm not saying it's a bad card, I just hate when a lot of your payoffs for a tribe in a tribal set, not that this is a tribal set, but it has a tribal sub-theme to it. I hate when the payoffs are not of that tribe, right? It reminds me of Ixalan, where like you were supposed to draft these tribal decks, but they were just like half the set was creatures that weren't of any of the given tribes, and it just meant that you were like scrapping for certain creatures of a creature type. You would just play like these really bad creatures because they had the right creature type, and most of your deck would just be like bats and hounds and stuff like that. And it's like, why? Why couldn't this have been something relevant? I don't know. It's not a bad card. I'm not knocking it. I'm just, you know, going on a little bit of a mini rant about tribal stuff. It's fine, right? If you have a couple humans, this is good, but don't take a Patasia Tiger and then think for some reason that you have to start moving into a human deck, because it's not like it gives the creature fly-in. That's what you would assume this fly-in cat would do, right? Is give a creature, a human, like +2/+2 and fly-in for the turn. It doesn't do that. It just gives it +2/+2. So it might still not even enable a good attack, since a lot of your humans are often going to be like dorky small creatures. But it's a fine standalone card if you just need a flyer in your deck. Moving on. No more complaining. I promise. I don't promise. Weaponize the Monsters is a single red mana for an uncommon enchantment. For 2 mana, you can sack a creature to deal 2 damage to any target. So you got kind of this more expensive Goblin Bombardment type ability, right? You know, sack a creature, deal 2 to anything is a pretty strong effect. It does cost 2 mana. You're down a card when you play this, unless you're using it right away. And really, you're just down a card because you have to sack a creature in order to probably kill a creature. Again, I need to see like the token generation. There is a common, we saw it last time, that makes like 2 mana, make a 1/1 human and a 1/1 dinosaur. That's pretty strong with this card, but you're really only killing your opponent's small creatures unless you're activating this multiple times, in which case you're sacking a bunch of creatures, stuff like that. I don't know. I need to see more sack fodder before I'm excited about this card, but it could be a very powerful build-around type card. If you have effects that make multiple creatures, if you are able to generate tokens with any sort of effect, or maybe you have another enchantment that can just like continuously generate tokens, this can be like a win con completely in itself while also controlling the board. So I don't know. I'm not going to knock it yet. I just haven't really seen the tools that make me think it's well supported. In just an average deck, would you play this card? You have a deck with like, let's say 18 creatures, 5 spells, something like that. Is this one of your spells that you're playing? Probably not, right? you have to be willing to sack creatures, and this is fine against like pacifisms or fine against opposing removal because your opponent goes to kill your creature and you're like, well, I might as well get some use out of anyway, sacrifice it, and then I don't know, shoot something. There's an interesting thing you can do here too, since a lot of the mutate costs are cheaper than this is super corner case, but a lot of the mutate costs are cheaper than the actual costs on the creature. So you can cast a spell with a mutate and then use this to sacrifice the target if you don't really care about the mutate stuff. And that's just a tiny little way to get your creature out for cheaper, assuming that you also have the 2 mana to pay for this. I don't know. I don't even know why I brought that up, but it's a thing that can happen, and I just don't see it yet. This is a very powerful effect, but I don't want to just sack my creatures to shock things. I want to make sure that I have token generation. Maybe if there's like a balls to the wall just aggro deck in this format, it gets your opponent down to like 8 super quick and then your opponent stabilizes. Maybe this is a good way to finish them off, right? Turn all your creatures into shocks. So maybe it's strong there. I just don't really quite see it yet, and it's not replacing like your Goblin Bombardments or anything like that in other formats. So is it going to see constructed play? I have no idea. Is it good for limited? I don't honestly know. That's one that has me stumped. But let's go ahead and move on. Essence Symbiont is 1 in a green. This is a bear with sets mechanic, kind of. It's a 2/2 common beast. So 2 mana 2/2 common beast, just typical bear. It says whenever a creature you control mutates, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature, and you gain 2 life. Excuse me. This is pretty sweet, and I think the reason I actually really like this card is because you don't have to necessarily mutate onto it, right? You can just have this sitting there, and you will get extra bonuses for doing all your other mutate stuff. 2 life, not irrelevant, especially if you do that multiple times throughout the game. Every mutate creature you it's not worded like one of the other ones where it's like if that creature had a mutate, do the thing. No, you actually have to mutate the creature. But each mutate creature comes with an additional +1/+1 counter, and that's pretty strong. This I can see going like turn 2 this, turn 3 mutate onto probably this. It gets a +1/+1 counter. You gain 2 life, and you get whatever extra mutate ability was attached to that creature. And you're probably upgrading the stats on this, so you can probably be attacking for like 4 or 5 damage given the right mutate creature on turn 3, which is pretty crazy. That might just win the game on its own. That's what has me a little bit scared about this set, is that there are potentials. There is the potential to just like curve out into a powerful mutate creature and then not be able to be stopped because it's huge, right? I don't know if that's actually how things are going to play out, but I have seen the tools to make that happen. And again, I think there's like this Sultai deck forming of mutate matters cards, right? We saw the blue frog that can loot when you mutate, makes your mutate creatures cheaper. We saw the black mamba that gives things a -2/-2 when it mutates. And now this, which gains you a little bit of life and makes your mutate creature stronger. It's a powerful little shell of commons and uncommons that I think are all going to see quite a bit of play. This one I like especially because you don't have to mutate onto it to make it relevant, but there's some scary potential going on with these mutate cards, not gonna lie. Next up, Joyous Skybonder is 1 Azorius for a human wizard with flying. It's a 2/2, so 3 mana 2/2 with flying. Got a Windrake there, that's fine. Windrake, it's not quite Vexing Goal anymore, but we got a Windrake nonetheless. This says creatures you control with flying have spells your opponents cast that target. This creature costs 2 more to cast. So in addition to itself, all of your other flyers are now harder to target. Only by spells. You can still activate abilities for normal cost. Like there's a decent number of tappers and stuff like that. It doesn't cost extra to tap something like this. But if they want to use their removal spell, or they want to bounce this back to your hand, or they want to do whatever, they are going to have to pay 2 extra to do it, and that's just a fine ability to have, right? It's usually not like a make it or break it ability on just normal cards and limited, but it does make your opponent, tax themselves a little bit, and that can have a relevant effect on their curve, especially if they just need to kill something. It spreads it out to your other flyers too. I guess based on this card that the blue-white theme for Ikoria is Flying Matters. Nothing else is really coming to mind as far as a Flying Matters card, but I guess that's the theme, right? It seems like we're going to get a cycle of these as well. A cycle of maybe hybrid uncommons that cares about a certain keyword. And I assume it's also only going to be a half cycle, right? Only 5 cards. Because we saw the Trample one. Red-green is obviously Trample Matters. Red-black is Menace Matters, but I don't think we've seen like an uncommon red-black card that cares about it yet. And green-white is like Vigilance Matters. And what's the other one? There'd be blue-white, green-white, red-black, green-red, and then there should be blue-back. Oh, right, the flash stuff, right? The flash stuff matters. So I don't know if flying, obviously blue-white is typically a flyers matters deck, but I don't know that there's a lot of synergy there. Just blue-white flyers is typically like, its own little self-contained engine or self-contained archetype in most sets. So I don't know, support card, whatever. Let's move on to Parcelbeast. Parcelbeast is 2 green blue for a 2/4 elemental beast. 4 mana 2/4, fine, whatever, right? Not exactly stats that you're excited about. It has mutate for 2 mana, so it's green blue. That's it. So mutate. If you go 1 drop and then you mutate this on turn 2, suddenly you have a 2 mana 2/4. It doesn't actually have a mutate ability, right? It doesn't say when this creature mutates, do something, which is apparently really rare for mutate creatures in this set. Most of them have a mutate ability. This one does not. It has a tap ability. It says 1, tap it, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land, put it onto the battlefield. If you don't put it on your battlefield, put it into your hand. What? Okay. So this is 1 tap, draw a card. And if that card happens to be a land, put it onto the battlefield. So more of that kind of Risen Reef type effect. I'm really sick of these Simic cards just being good, right? I'm tired of Simic just having so much card advantage that other decks can't keep up with it. That's just me being an old-timey, whippersnapper complainer. But this card is very powerful. I would be willing to pay 4 mana for this, right? 4 mana for a creature that said 1 tap, draw a card. That's what this card is, but it has like multiple upsides. It lets you ramp if you are actually drawing lands. It lets you filter a top card of your library off if, that matters for some reason. And it mutates pretty cheaply, right? Plus, you can just mutate onto this. I don't see why you would most of the time. But you can get this going pretty early in the game and just have your own personal draw engine. There are a lot of draw engines in this set. I'm sorry. There's just a ton of ways to just draw extra cards. And that usually makes for good limited, but also means that some people just can't keep up if they have a bad deck, which I'm not a huge fan of. But anyway, let's move on. Hornbash Mentor. This looks like a Cons of Tarkir card. Hornbash Mentor is 2 and a green for a 3/3 uncommon human warrior. 3 mana 3/3. Perfectly respectable stats. We already talked about that on the vanilla test. It says, when it enters the battlefield, put a trample counter on target non-human creature you control. So interestingly enough, it cannot put a counter on itself, which is a little bit weird, but you do get to put a counter on something else. Makes it a little bit awkward on curve, right? Because you ideally want to put a trample counter on like a big creature, something like that. But if you go like 2-drop, 3-drop, you might just not have like a 2-drop that you care about giving trample to. Thankfully, it has an activated ability that kind of makes up for that. It says 2 and a green, tap it, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with trample. Okay, that's actually pretty sweet. And I guess it would have been too strong for this to put a +1/+1 counter on itself. It's also a little awkward that you're putting like +1/+1 counters and trample counters on the same thing. So, there's just going to be a lot of counters floating around this set. That's just a fact that we have to recognize and accept. Our counter overlords have deemed it so. But if you have one other creature with trample on board and, nothing else to do with your mana, maybe it's a board stall, you can activate this to make your trampler bigger. And putting +1/+1 counters on creatures with trample does matter, right? Ideally, you want trample creatures to be really big. On a, in a dedicated green-red deck that just has quite a few tramplers, this card can be just like a mythic uncommon for that deck, right? And, if you start getting to the point where you're putting 2 +1/+1 counters on the board with a single activation, this card can get out of hand very quickly and just bury your opponent in damage. So it's a cool card. 3 mana, 3/3 that gives something else trample permanently would be a card that I'd already be pretty happy to play. And then the activated ability gives not only its archetype, just like a really powerful tool, but just as its own self-contained card, 3 mana 3/3 that can start pumping some other creature with trample seems pretty good to me. Hornbash Mentor seems really strong. Does benefit from being supported with other tramplers, but good enough on its own, right? Moving on, Siegfried and Roy, we have Fight as a 1. A single white mana for an uncommon instant. Choose one or both. Target human creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains indestructible until end of turn. Or target non-creature human gains indestructible and gets +1/+1. So you can do either or both. 1 mana is enough that this is a fine combat trick. Giving your thing indestructible for 1 mana is usually fine, especially with mutate stuff, because again, you want to protect your mutate creatures if your plan is to just keep mutating onto the same creature over and over again. The awkward thing, of course, being that you can't mutate onto humans, so you normally wouldn't be able to use this sort of effect on that pile, but thankfully it has that second part where you can target a non-human as well. So you could just play this in a deck that doesn't have humans or in a deck that has all humans, but ideally you want some of those cards I was just complaining about, like the Wolf Bear or the Patasia Tiger, these cards that, do something with humans but aren't humans themselves. If you end up in a sort of deck like that where you are a human deck ideally, but you also have a couple of those non-human human payoffs, then Fight as 1 becomes a pretty strong card because, 1 mana. This costs 1 mana. It's not like you have to kick it or something to get the second effect. 1 mana to make 2 of your creatures indestructible and pump them both can be just an enormous blowout. And you always have the option to just use this to essentially like counter a removal spell, right? Your opponent goes, okay, I'm going to deal 5 damage, or I'm going to play, 2 mana destroy target creature on this guy, and you just go, okay, Fight as 1. It basically functioned as a counter spell, basically gave your creature hexproof till end of turn. I guess indestructible is fine. So this seems like a powerful tool. If you only get one mode, it's just fine, right? That wouldn't be anything to gawk at. But if you get to pull off both modes, like in the middle of combat or something like that, that's pretty insane. It's actually best friends with that Wolf Bear, right? Because the Wolf Bear already says you want to be attacking with it plus another human, and that's just perfect. There's your human target, there's your non-human target, and they're both attacking. I can't really think of too many better things to have than Fight as 1 if you're just sending everything you have, everything into combat like willy-nilly without worrying about how blocks are going to go. This is just going to blow your opponent out in that situation. Moving on, though, we've got 4 more cards to talk about, unless, again, something else pops up by the time we get to the end. The Ozolith, okay, is a single white mana for a legendary artifact. It's a rare. 1 mana artifact. Okay. It says whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. Doesn't matter what kind of counters. If it had fetch counters, if it had bounty counters, if it had clearly +1/+1 counters or ability counters like trample, vigilance, blah blah blah, so on and so forth. Whenever that creature leaves the battlefield, those counters get shifted over onto this artifact. And then it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. It's a little bit disappointing that you can't pick and choose which counters to move from the Ozolith onto that creature. So if for some reason you just have like 2 or 3 vigilance counters and 2 or 3 trample counters on the Ozolith, they all have to move over to that creature. But ideally, you want to store up +1/+1 counters, right? This is a good way to say, hey, if I'm putting all my resources here and here, and then those creatures get dealt with, those resources are going to be able to get shifted around to the new creatures that I play, or creatures I already have on board, and it triggers every combat, right? You do have to move all counters, though, which is a little awkward, depending on what kind of counters are there. But there aren't any negative counters in the set that I can think of, so, moving around multiple vigilance counters doesn't really change anything. It just means that you can't divvy it up as you want. Doesn't seem like an extremely powerful card for limited. There are clearly some shenanigans for commander. There's just all sorts of different counters going around that being able to move onto other creatures would be beneficial to do. But in limited, we're not first picking this card. There's no way. And you have to be in a deck that's super dedicated to counters before you care about this. Like, I don't even see this being a thing that you want in like your trample counter deck, right? If you're in red green and you have tons of way to make trample counters, you don't necessarily want this because most of the creatures you already play are going to have trample, or you might play creatures that don't care about having trample, like 2-mana tutus, stuff like that. But if you are in a deck that can generate a ton of +1/+1 counters, that's where this is actually great because you're changing the stat lines of other creatures. And essentially, the total power you have on board never changes. It only increases because anytime something dies, I mean, that's not true. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but anything something dies with +1/+1 counters, you get to kind of store those up and put them on another creature and make another threat your opponent has to deal with, and you just get to kind of keep shifting it around. But I don't know. The Ozolith, it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. It is a neat card. It's got some potential in other formats, but for limited, I don't think we're going to be playing that card too much. Magma Charger, 3 and a red for a 3/3 dinosaur. There's one of those hill giants. It is 4-mana uncommon 3/3 dinosaur. When it attacks, if it doesn't have first strike, put a first strike counter on it. When it attacks, if it has first strike, it gains double strike until end of turn. Okay. So notice that, wow, this is confusing. I can see this being one of those cards that people have to reread a lot, but it puts a first strike counter on it, but it only gives double strike till end of turn. And having both first strike and double strike at the same time leads to some really awkward scenarios in the middle of combat if like a counter can be removed or something like that. But that's so corner case that it's not worth talking about here. Let's assume this card just goes off and does its thing. Is it good? 4-mana 3/3 first striker is pretty strong, and that's what it's going to be when it attacks the first time. And that is a first strike counter, so it'll just then permanently have first strike. The first time you play it, if you're getting beat down, this doesn't block super well because it won't have first strike yet, and you have to get it into combat the next turn to give it first strike, so it's not going to block that turn either. So it's not like this is a good stabilizing card, but it's a decent attacker. I would pay 4 mana for a 3/3 first strike attacker. That's just hard to rumble with. It's hard to double block. And then after that, it starts attacking as a double striker, and that's pretty powerful, right? Also, just something to keep in mind here. I don't know if there's a way to do it or not. If you can play this and then before it attacks the first time, give it first strike, maybe put a first strike counter on it with some other ability, it'll just start attacking as a double striker right away, right? It doesn't care where it got first strike from. It just cares that it has first strike. Actually, whenever it attacks, if it doesn't have first strike, put a first strike counter on it. No, you can't stack the triggers here, right? There's no... When it attacks, put both triggers on the stack. I don't believe the second ability will trigger at all. I'm not sure. I wonder, there's no way that this just attacks and you go, oh, stack the triggers so that it gains first strike and then resolve the double strike trigger and now it has double strike. That's not a thing, right? I'm a little confused now because they're attack triggers, but they are if clauses. So they might not trigger at all. Like this ability that gains double strike might just not go on the stack at all unless it already has first strike. So I'm a little confused there that both of these might trigger during the same attack step. I don't know, a little bit confusing, but let's assume everything we said about it is fine. Seems like a good attacker, and that's about it. Not a lot of synergy there. Next up, Heartless Act. Oh, this is a story spotlight. Is General Kudrow gonna kill like what's his face is Lucas Tiger guy? Because that seems... I was kind of liking that guy. Anyway, Heartless Act, 1 and a black, uncommon instant. Choose one, destroy target creature with no counters on it, or remove up to 3 counters from target creature. Okay, so obviously using the card to just remove counters from creatures isn't good unless it's like one of those base 0/0 creatures. We saw that War of the Spark card, Price of Betrayal, 1 mana, remove 5 counters from something. That was a playable card because they were planeswalkers and because they were the, army tokens and stuff like that. But it wasn't like a card that you were just clamoring to have. It's just a card you could play. It was a product of its format that it was playable. If this was it, just, remove 3 counters from target creature. That's not playable. That's not going to cut it. It's an option to have on a better card, which is what this is. But it's not a reason to play the card. What you really care about here is 2 mana, destroy target creature with no counters on it. that is extremely efficient removal, almost universal. It doesn't care what kind of creature it is, but there are a lot of counters in this set, which is something that kind of takes away from this. This has similar design space to something like, Cast Down. Think about Cast Down from Dominaria. Just 1 in a black, destroy target non-legendary creature. That's going to kill most things you want to kill, but it's not going to kill your opponent's best card necessarily. That was a format that cared about legendary creatures, and one of the best removal spells couldn't kill legendary creatures. This is a removal spell that can't kill creatures with counters, and a lot of the cards in the set just happen to have counters on them or put counters places. Plus, this can be fizzled with like an instant that gives a counter or something like that. So, this is going to kill 50% of the creatures in the format, and a removal spell this cheap that's going to kill half my opponent's creatures is still a good removal spell. It just may not always necessarily kill everything I want it to. So keep that in mind. This is a strong card. You should be drafting it and probably taking it highly. Probably first couple picks in a draft for sure. And you'll be happy to play as many copies as you get. But just keep in mind, it doesn't kill 100%. This is not 2-mana murder. It is not 2-mana murder. It is 2-mana like Cast Down-esque effect. I wish I had a better way of saying that, right? Just won't always kill stuff. Oh, look, new spoilers. The second we went away. Is that a nightmare squirrel? Anyway. So looks like we're going to have a few more cards to talk about. We were going to wrap up with Reptilian Mirroring. We're not anymore, but we'll still talk about this one. 2 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever you cycle a card, you may have Reptilian Mirroring become a 5/4 dinosaur with trample and haste in addition to its other types until end of turn. So basically you have an enchantment that's sitting there not doing anything, and then whenever you cycle, it becomes a 5/4 trample haste. The fact that it has haste means that on turn 4 you can play this, and then you can cycle one of the 1-mana cyclers away and then just attack with a 5/4. You do have to have a lot of cycling in order to justify this, right? If you have like 3 cycling cards in your deck, don't play this because you're going to cycle those cards away before playing this, or you're going to, cycle... You're just going to cast those cycling cards, and then this will just end up being a dead enchantment on board that doesn't do anything. If you are the cycling deck and you have 10, 11, 12 cycling cards in your deck, this seems pretty strong. You can do it on offense or defense. Keep a cycling card in your hand and then have a surprise blocker. It is on board. Your opponent's going to see it coming, but, they have to kind of respect that it can become a 5/4 at any point. Plus, it has trample, which matters for some of the red cards in this set. So just seems like a strong build-around type card. The Cyclone deck has quite a few of those now. We've seen 2 blue build-around uncommons. We've seen white build-around uncommon. Now we've seen a red build-around uncommon. So the whole Jeskai Cyclone deck definitely has tools that pay you off for Cyclone. And this seems, about as good as any other one. It's an onboard trick, right? It's like, hey, this is a thing, prepare for it. It gives your opponent, a little bit of time to kind of prepare for it. But it's also, a 5/4 for 3 is pretty strong. If this was just a 3-mana 5/4, and that's all it was, then your opponent would have to deal with that too, so they've got to respect this as well. It is worth noting that some decks will be playing, an above average number of artifact or enchantment removal spells because of cycling in this format, so your enchantments aren't just like 100% safe. Sometimes people will be main decking a way to kill it, and they will certainly bring in cycle and naturalize effects to take care of cards like this. So the enchantment payoffs for the cycling deck are a little bit more vulnerable or exposed than they normally otherwise would be, but that doesn't necessarily make them bad, right? It just means that they might get answered more often than not. Also interesting, that one does not have cycling. It is not one of the cycling payoffs that you can actually cycle itself. A couple comments here. Officer of the post of the check or something like that. Checkpoint officer. I already know this is going to be a boring card, right? 1 and a white for a 1/2 human soldier. Okay, that's not bad. 1 and a white, tap target creature. A little bit expensive of a tapper, but even a tapper like this that you don't care about the stat line, it's still a tapper, right? 2-mana tappers are fine. This holds things down. If you just need to control the board a little bit, you need to keep something off your back, or you need to get through with your creatures, there you go, there's a tapper. And we've seen a couple tappers in this set, so I'm a little bit happy to have white get a tapper back. That's one of the things that white, they kind of took away from white and then white started getting bad in limited sets, and that's because one of their like common ways to deal with threats was tappers. They took them away, but here's just a generic tapper, about as like generic and I don't want to say bad, but like mediocre as you can get for a common tapper. But still, this should play a role of just, you know, controlling your opponent's creatures. Also a human, so you probably care about it a little bit more in your black-white decks. Next up, Helica Glider. Helica, I suppose. Nightmare Squirrel, 6 legs. 2 and a white. 2/2. Common. Nightmare Squirrel. Helica Glider enters the battlefield with your choice of a flying counter or a first strike counter. So either modal card, 3 mana 2/2 flyer, which I assume is what you'll pick most of the time, or 3 mana 2/2 first striker, which is a fine card. 3 mana 2/2 first striker is not like insane, but it's fine. You know, it's pretty good blocker. Early in the game, it wears equipment and auras, and you can mutate onto it pretty happily, and becomes a little bit better. You know, first strike good on big creatures. It gets a little bit worse on small creatures. But, you know, at the very worst, I'm thinking this is like a Windrake that you can take away flying to give first strike. So it's not like a strictly better Windrake. I guess it's strictly better Windrake, right? Because it can just be a Windrake, but it has a different option. Yeah, Helica Glider seems like a solid common. If blue-white cares about flyers, this is a fine card. If some other deck cares about first strikers, then I guess this works there too. So it might be able to split into multiple different archetypes. But as a standalone card, 3 mana 2/2 flyer is not the worst thing in the world. Next up, Splendor Mare. It's Elmer. It's 2 and a white for a 3/3. Another 3 mana 3/3. There's so many of those. It's an uncommon Elk Unicorn. Elk Unicorn? So it has one horn and then it has elk horns? Doesn't the word unicorn mean one horn? Like, what? Anyway, 3 mana 3/3 lifelink. That's pretty good. Cycling for 1 and a white, sure. I'm happy with my 3 mana 3/3 lifelinker, but if you want to throw cycling on there, I'm pretty happy with it. And then when you cycle it, you put a lifelink counter on target creature you control. So this is part of that cycle. We saw the green one, we saw the black one that give a counter to a creature whenever you cycle it. And this is a pretty powerful card. I imagine this is one of the cyclers where you're actually not going to cycle it very often because it is a pretty significant creature. 3 mana 3/3 lifelinker is good, but the fact that you have cycling on top of it, and this is in the cycling colors, means that this is just all around a very good card. If you care about counters, if you care about just curving out, if you care about cycling, this kind of fits the bill. I don't understand what an Elk Unicorn is supposed to be, but the card is sweet. Definitely one of the limited kind of like bread and butter all-star uncommons that you can get here. And then what do we have left? Just a unicorn. This one's not an elk. Majestic Auricorn? Auricorn? It's like an Auriok with a unicorn horn, I guess, is the idea. It's 4 and a white for a 4/4 vigilance. Okay. Whenever this creature mutates, you gain 4 life, and the mutate cost is 3 and a white. So 5 mana 4/4. That is usually playable. Vigilance, okay, sure, you can throw Vigilance on. It doesn't really change whether I want to play a 5 mana 4/4 or not, but Vigilance does help it a little bit, makes it a decent blocker and attacker, and then you can mutate to gain some life. This seems fine. It's uncommon, and this doesn't feel like an uncommon, but I guess it's because you can actually gain a ton of life. I guess if you're playing against an aggro deck and you play this, you mutate and gain 4 life, and then you mutate again onto it, the game's probably just over for the aggro player. You've gained 8 life, you've added 4 power and toughness to the board, and they're probably attacking you now because it has vigilance, so sure. Not the mutate creature that I'm going to be dying for, but if it's in my sideboard and I'm not main decking it for some reason, I'm definitely bringing it in against aggro decks, and they're probably just not going to beat this card. It actually seems powerful against them and seems fairly mediocre otherwise. It has a vigilance as well, which green-white seems to care about, despite the fact that I've only seen one card that really cares about vigilance. But we'll see if more stuff pops up. Oh, we've got more. Are we getting the full spoiler here? We're not getting the full spoiler, are we? If so, we're going to cut this video and talk about cards separately. We have Spontaneous Flight, 2 and a white, instant, common. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Put a flying counter on it. Okay, so it looks like we are probably going to get a cycle of these as well. instant speed tricks that put a counter on a creature rather than just giving it that ability. We saw the trample one already, right? 2 and a green, target creature gets +3/+3 and a trample counter. This is 2 and a white, +2/+2 and a flying counter, which is about the same. Think Mighty Leap. Mighty Leap was a 1 and a white, target creature gets +2/+2 and flying. A pretty mediocre combat trick, but was just like something you would use in combat to try and take down your opponent's flyer or push in a win. This actually permanently gives your creature flying, so it might upgrade a creature while also pushing in a little bit of extra damage. So probably fine. I don't know how much that flying counter is going to matter. So again, we'll have to keep an eye out for it. But if it ends up mattering, that card gets a little bit better. Next up, Garrison Cat. Look how majestic this cat is. Like, I'm own this place. Single white mana for a 1/1. Common cat. When it dies, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. Again, like, what's with the off creature type human generators and human payoffs? I don't get it. I don't understand the idea. It's a cool cat. This card is fine. Usually, these 1/1s that die into other 1/1s tend to play a role in their given format. We've seen like Doom Traveler. We've seen that one from Guilds of Ravnica that died into a lifelink and token. This is fine, but if I'm looking for more humans, I don't want this card, right? Maybe if I'm looking for sacrifice fodder, I guess with that companion where you can cast 1 and 2 drops from your graveyard, I guess this is a card that you're pretty happy to play with it because it generates something when it dies, and then you can just replay it out of the graveyard. So just looking for a way to sacrifice it for that to actually go off. But as a standalone card, I don't know why I want this card. I don't really want to mutate onto my 1-drop with no abilities. I don't really want this in my human deck just so that when it eventually chump blocks, I'm going to make a human. I don't really know. I'm sure it'll see play. I'm sure if you're trying to curve out in your aggro deck, it'll be fine. I'm sure in your human deck, it'll serve some sort of purpose, but it's not really a card I'm super excited about. Anyway, let's go ahead and stop there before more cards eventually spoil up. We just got a bunch of white cards here, so I'm wondering if the full set has been released and it's just being like filtered into Mythic Spoiler. But if that is the case, I would like to stop here, keep this its own standalone separate video, and then I guess there's still quite a few cards left, but if the full spoiler comes out, we will probably do like a 2-parter to go ahead and cover the rest of the set here. So let's go ahead and call that a good stopping point before we have to review an entire set in this video. And yeah, thanks for hanging out. As always, lots of cool stuff here. Again, just a lot of weird designs, a lot of questionable things that I'm not sure about, like this Weaponize the Monsters card, and we've got these trample counter things, we've got this human synergy with these non-human cards. I don't know, a lot of weird stuff going on here, but I think the set is really shaping together. The archetypes are coming together and stuff like that, and we probably only got a batch of like commons and uncommons left, maybe a rare or 2 left. So I will see you guys when those come out. Thanks for watching. As always, again, feel free to subscribe. If you're still at this point in the video, do me a favor, subscribe to the channel. If not, it's cool, just hanging out. Find us on Twitter, MTG_ManaRocks. And yeah, let's go ahead and have a good day, and I'll see you all next time.